You're tuning in to the Raised by Rentals program. This podcast will contain strong language and spoilers for decades-old media properties.
Join us.
Welcome, everybody. This is the podcast where we usually examine pop culture franchises of the VHS era and improv new stories to imagine how we might improve our favorite movies, TV, and games. But in today's special Super Gushers episode, you're all invited to our new storytelling class because it's long past time that we school some fools. I'm Jefe.
I'm Unc.
And we were raised by rentals. Unc! Wait, I've been yelling Mike all these years. Is this the evil twin version of you?
I do have a goatee, so
Oh, God, I knew it. You're like evil Spock. But Mike, tell me, why Unc? Why are you Unc? And I'll let all the folks out there know why we are here today as Unc and Jefe.
Well, it's kind of one of those nicknames that I was not expecting, and one that didn't really stick, unfortunately. But last year there were a couple of younger guys working at the hospital that they would often come in and out of my office, because my office, we have all the keys and the radios, and so we're the catch-all department. Everyone has to come in to sign stuff out.
Mhm.
So some of the younger security guards, when they would come in to sign out radios and stuff, they would hear me listening to my 90s playlists of lots of hip hop and rap, and they'd be like, "What you listening to? And they'd come in. The one time the guy heard me listening to Ice Cube, but he just stood there and he went, "All right, Unc, I see you." And I went, "Wait, what?" He started referring to me as Unc for quite a while because every time he came in, I was listening to old school rap. So
Nice. Definitely take
I
that as a
was
compliment.
dubbed Unc. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I've learned only recently, after you told me that story, and I kept thinking about it every time, I'm in my car and some kind of G-funk anthem from the 90s comes on, right? Some Warren G's Regulate with Nate Dogg, or some Dr. Dre or something. And I think
Right.
about that, but I learned relatively recently that I guess that's a like Gen Z or maybe even Gen Alpha term for the person in the friend group who is into like outdated, like old-fashioned shit, like the person who still says like the old slang when it's like not cool anymore. Like it's like, all right, Unc,
Yep.
you know.
It's a nice way of saying you old.
Exactly, right. But I think there's some respect. I think when you actually are old, it's like, all right, cool. Like, I'll let you refer to me by your Gen Z slang.
Exactly.
Embrace it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it never seemed insulting. It was always just like, oh, you're that old guy listening to old music, and it's like, yeah, whatever.
Give me something old school.
I was gonna say he's not wrong. I am that old guy listening to old music. So.
Exactly right. Oh man, and unfortunately, my nickname of being Jefe also, no one really calls me that very often anymore, but for years that was my nickname at work because one of the guys I used to work with, who then eventually I became his boss and he worked for me as a supervisor. This guy Joe, he knew several languages. He was from India, and there's lots of languages within India itself, and so they kind of grew up just learning a few, and it's helpful. But then because he worked for American companies, he started learning other languages, and so many people speak Spanish, like even in American companies, that he had started to learn Spanish and to practice. Like he knew that I used to live in El Paso, and I can't really speak it, but I can read it pretty well. So we would be talking on, Teams messages or emails, and he would start writing to me in Spanish, and Jefe just means boss, and it was literally him just saying like, "Hey, boss man, like check this out," and he just and then we became friends even when we didn't work together anymore, and he's just always called me Jefe, and then other people started doing it, so it kind of followed me around for a while.
Nice.
I've had a lot of nicknames over the years. I was Cinco for like 4 or 5 years back in the day, and Pseudo for a while. I don't think they rhymed on purpose, but anyway.
See, now I didn't have any nice nicknames when I was younger, so
Yeah.
I'm not gonna repeat any of them lest they follow me into my old age. So
Yeah, yeah, I see that. Even the pseudo one didn't start off very nice. It was more of like, being called like this guy who fucking thinks he knows everything, like a know-it-all, this like pseudo intellectual over here. But it just kind of stuck for a
Mm.
while. But that's a segue into our topic for today because we wanted to take an opportunity to just talk a little bit about what we do in terms of storytelling. We get on the podcast most of the time, and we end
Mhm.
up coming up with a story. We try to tell a story beginning to end. We improv it as much as possible, just off the cuff. We have to plan some things out ahead of time. At least to the degree that we can both get on a recording session and like know what we're going to talk about, right?
Right, without stepping all over each other, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's at least a little bit of a pedigree that we've developed, over I mentioned before, like I've been calling you Mike all these years, and it's like, yeah, we're in season 5. We've been doing Raise by Rentals now, for more than 4 years, which, I guess all these years, it makes it sound like so much longer, but hey, why not? um,
Right.
but in all this time we've been doing Raise by Rentals, we've done our rental rant specials and our Super Gushers specials, but we've also done 87 full length episodes, most of them well over an hour or 2 or 3 long, where we've told beginning to end stories. So, again, almost 90 episodes where we have told stories.
I didn't even realize it's been that long. Damn.
Yeah, yeah. I actually counted them up recently for a different reason, and it was another one of those things that made me think about doing this episode because I was like, yeah, man, I just like talking about storytelling, and I got into a little bit of a, I won't call it an argument, but I got into a little bit of a heated chat on a Facebook fan group recently, and I really don't like going on social media and arguing with people or getting in the comments. I avoid
Uh,
it like the
good shit.
plague most of the time.
I'm right there with you. I fucking hate that. In fact, I just did a TikTok drawing about this very topic.
Nice.
About people who go online and just bitch loudly at each other because it's like, sure, that's going to convince someone to change their mind. Just yell at them louder.
Right. I mean, isn't that how you convince people that you're right? Just the louder and
Exactly.
more angry you are, like the more condescending and arrogant you are. I mean, that's how you change someone's mind, right?
Of course, that means you're more correct. I fucking
Exactly.
hate that.
Exactly. But I do belong to a lot of Facebook groups. I think the only thing Facebook is good for at all anymore are these private groups that you can create. And I belong to a lot of, you know, fan and pop culture focused ones, fans of certain comic book artists or fans of certain bands. And some of the ones I belong to have become huge communities to the point where there's an entire comic book publisher and a whole library of comics that you can buy in like regular comic book stores that were birthed out of one of these groups that I belong to. And that was, side note, just a really cool thing to kind of like watch happen from the sidelines.
Mhm.
That was one of the reasons I used to do Comics Boost back in the day, was just trying to like, help out as much as I could and like trying to pimp those guys as much as I could. But side tangent. Anyway, what I was saying is I go into these groups with what you think are like-minded people, and I'll say a hot take of some kind, like, "Oh man, have you seen this comic?" Or like, "When did this trend start?" And then no matter how like-minded people are, you always end up having people who want to disagree with you. And then I have to sit back and not give in to my urge to just immediately comment to explain why they're wrong. Yeah. to the, to the,
Yeah.
to the point where, this example that I'm thinking of, I literally just sat on it for 2 days to the point where somebody commented like, "Hello, are you still there? Like, why did you post this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, fine. It's time to talk." But it was about storytelling and just uh, tips or sort of guidelines that people follow in different media. There's lots of books written about screenwriting and the formula of how to write a screenplay, right down to what should happen on page 5 and page 10, like very,
Right.
very specific. And there are guidelines in comics that are kind of the same. And I use the word guidelines, and I used it in my Facebook post. And I was trying to be very clear, and I, made it very explicit in my little mini rant that yes, I know there's no such thing as hard and fast rules. There is no one way to write a comic book or to write a movie or whatever. But in this particular example, what I was saying was there used to be these sort of commonly accepted guidelines in, I'll say, mainstream comics for, ways to put together a comic book that are like a shortcut or a fast track to making the comic appealing. I won't get into all the examples right now, but the people in this group knew exactly what I was talking about. Like there's things that will help you if you keep them in mind. Like use your first page this way. Think about the beats of the story, introduce your characters in this type of way, and make sure you mention X, Y, and Z. Like just basic guidelines if you want to get your point across. And it's especially good for people who are amateurs who have never written a comic before or don't really know what they're doing. And that was the example that I had given in the in my little mini rant. Was I was like, here's a comic by a professional, and here's a comic that is obviously written by someone who's never done this before, which I knew because it was like some guy from some band that used to be famous who was like trying to write a comic. And I was like, you can tell the difference without, if you had no idea who these two people were, you could look at this comic and look at this comic, and I bet you guys could point out the professional. And then that sort of led into the, well, the other guy, he's just like, following his muse and making his art. I'm like, I get it. Like, I didn't say he shouldn't make the comic. I'm just saying he clearly doesn't know the rules. He doesn't know the guidelines.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, and it's no, that's the same thing. That's the same thing with all art, really, because like even like visual art, you have okay, you have people like Mike Mignola, who are like fucking amazingly talented artists, but he has a very unique style that is uniquely his. But why does it work so well? Because the guy took the time to become a very talented artist before he created his own style. So it's like
Hmm.
he understood the rules. He understood how to properly shade a scene. He understood how to like draw your foreground, midground, background, like how to compose an image, how to compose a picture. He knew that language before he started his own style. And we've talked about this before, maybe even on this very podcast, but I know you and I have discussed this in person many times over. When I first discovered Mike Mignola's artwork, I fucking hated it,
Hmm. Yep.
because it was those uncanny X-Men, like the re-releases. I forget what they were called, like the classics, I think they might
Hmm.
have been called.
Yeah,
um
X-Men Classic. He did the covers.
Yes, and I fucking hated those covers. I thought that this I was like, because again, I'm coming from the '90s school of big guns, big pecs, big tits art,
Hmm.
and then you got Mike Mignola with this bizarre like anatomy, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? This is terrible. And then I saw Hellboy, and I was like, whoa, what the fuck? Like this guy's really good. And then it clicked. It's like, oh, he was finding that style during that, like
Hmm.
he went from a very traditionally, trained artist or comic artist to using his unique voice there, but he was able to do that better because he already knew the rules. Once you
Hmm.
know the language, you can expand on it. So a
Yeah.
lot of times that your amateur outing, sometimes you capture lightning in a bottle and other times you're just fumbling in the dark.
Hmm.
And that's kind of why having a slight understanding of the rules, understanding the language, it's kind of important because with those tools, that first outing can be so much better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, and I love the fact that you mentioned language. I think that's a much better way to explain the point that I was trying to get at. And this is the first of the storytelling tips here, which is that it's important that you understand the language of what you're trying to do, whether it's the format of like a single issue comic versus a graphic novel, or like a short film versus a full length film, or just the medium, right? Is it a
Hmm.
movie? Is it a comic? Is it a novel? It's important that you understand the language in much the same way that when you're learning to speak a foreign language, you should learn how to speak it in the quote unquote proper way, like the textbook way, and then you learn the slang, or you pick up
Hmm.
the local phrases and the ways that people in, say Mexico say certain things in Spanish versus the way people in Costa Rica say certain things. You pick up those sort of like regionalities, and that makes you much better as a speaker of that language. But when people compliment other folks who speak, your language as a second language, they say, "Oh, you're so fluent." What they really mean is that they've developed a style that you recognize, and they don't sound like they're just reading it out of a textbook, you know?
Absolutely. Well, and it's this whole idea of language. It goes with anything that anything you enjoy. So, like, understanding like a horror movie, for example. If you
Hmm.
understand the tropes and cliches of a horror movie, you're going to understand the story much better by understanding the language of that movie. It's like video games, for example. Now, I'm a lifelong gamer. I know you've played on and off with certain games, but like the language of video games from childhood. Now
Hmm.
let's take someone like my mother. If I threw her into, like, here, play this game, is she going to understand why is that block outlined in yellow? Oh,
Hmm.
you can interact with it. So why does that wall have cracks in it?
Hmm.
Clearly you need a bomb to blow it up and get the treasure behind it.
Yeah.
But like you understand the language
Hmm.
of the video game. Like every medium you have has a specific language that once you're acclimated to it, once you understand it, everything about it kind of unlocks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, I think about comics a lot because it's the thing I think about the most. It's the thing I spend the most time
Hmm.
on with. And you look at certain people in comics who are very experimental, or very, pro, what's the word, progressive in their approach. Sometimes there's a lot of people who complain about that because the complaints go back to, oh, this person, they don't understand comics, or, oh, they ruined comics or whatever. But what it really is it's people who understand the language to the point where now they can bend it. Now they can bend the rules. It's this. It goes back to your concept of like an artistic style. You have to know the rules so that when you bend them, you do it in a way that's appealing, that it makes sense. And it's not like if you're speaking a foreign language and you start throwing in slang, but if you don't understand the syntax and the grammar, it just sounds like gibberish.
Yep. It's like that. Oh God, why can't I think of his name? That Italian musician who did the song in English that's literally just gibberish
Yeah,
words.
yeah, right.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, and some of the words might be real English words, but they don't make any sense if you don't understand the rules of how to put them together, right? Um,
Hmm.
and I don't know if it necessarily fits with the way that we're describing like an artistic style, but I just think it's an interesting thing that, some people say that when an artist develops a distinctive style that is very much theirs, something that you can recognize, like a Mike Mignola on Hellboy, or I'm thinking of Rob Liefeld, with his superhero comics like Deadpool and X-Force, is the style is all the things they do wrong,
Yep.
which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. But also, well, why is it wrong? It's wrong because there are these established rules and guidelines that have been developed over decades, or hundreds of years depending on the medium. And when you do something that is different than, the middle of the road style, people recognize that, like, oh yeah, like that's Rob Liefeld. He uses lots of cross hatching, and he draws fists weird, where like how does the thumb fit, and it's like, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying like that's his style because it's quote unquote wrong. But what it becomes is very distinctive, to the point where every time I look at a Mike Mignola or a Rob Liefeld or any of these very distinctive comic artists, you know exactly who they are because you see the thing that isn't like everybody else.
Oh yeah. And I mean, in the case of both Rob Liefeld and Mike Mignola, it worked out very well for them in their careers. I mean, look at Liefeld. He was like what, one of the highest paid artists in the world for a short period of time.
Oh yeah, I think he was the first person to ever become a millionaire solely from income off of comic book sales. I think that's true. Um,
Yep.
yeah, and but then again, you go back and you look at his early comic book art, the stuff that he was doing at DC, and even before that, when he did some like fill-in stuff and some handbook illustrations at Marvel way back in I think '86 and '87. But
Hmm.
you would be hard pressed to recognize it unless you were specifically looking for it because he learned how to draw in a traditional style and then started having fun with it, you know?
Yep. In fact, he not to derail us even further, but I know one of the reasons he started getting so bombastic and crazy was his competition with McFarlane,
Oh yeah.
because they were both like in constant competition with each other with, who could make the more like crazy layout or the craziest scenes. And then you started getting that whole thing with both of their comics, with all of their layouts. You'd have that anchor image, that one big image on
Hmm.
each page with like the little panels next to it, and that became such a staple in comic books that most of the 90s you saw that exact layout in
Hmm.
comic books. It's like one big anchor image, like a dude jumping out at the viewer, and then three little panels showing the action.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I know we're really going down this rabbit trail a really long way, but what's interesting about that is it totally works. Like they figured out a way, all of those quote unquote, image style guys, they figured out a way to make these comic book pages really dynamic, not only from a storytelling perspective, but also commercially because at the end of the day
Hmm.
Tom McFarlane is a salesman before he's anything. He owns a toy company, he's a
Yep.
comic book artist, he's gotten into sports, but he's a salesman. And I forget where I read this, but he basically said that he would sell all of his original art and he noticed that the pages that was just like six panels of like people talking, nobody wanted to buy those, but when there was a big panel of Spider-Man swinging through the city, people would pay, double triple for those. And so he was like, well, I'm just going to put Spider-Man swinging through the city on every page.
Yep. So every page is valuable.
Exactly. But back to our topic at hand. Like we wanted to come together and kind of talk about like storytelling in general, and we thought like let's just kind of share some of these tips and tricks. And we went down this little trail about comics, but I think it segues us back on track in that what we're talking about are things like tropes. You mentioned that before, like kind of understanding the tropes of a horror movie, and I think that is the second tip that we're giving here, which is that if you're going to tell some kind of a story, and in a little bit I want to get into the nuts and bolts of how do you put a story together. I think we've got some interesting things we can chat about, but if you're going to tell a story, I think most people would probably start with something like, okay, well, it's a horror story, or it's a romance, or maybe you don't necessarily understand your genre, but I want to tell a story about like kids in high school because I'm in high school and kids like me. But you kind of figure out what kind of story it is, and then it's important to take that and think about the tropes and the cliches that are associated to that genre or that type of story, right?
Mhm.
Like in
Totally agree.
and and I'll swing the mic back to you when it comes to like horror. But like again, if you're going to tell an action story without even really thinking about it, you're going to be thinking about, oh, well, there's got to be like a car chase or like explosions or like a shootout, and it's like, you don't have to have those things in every story just because they were in Lethal Weapon, but you start to think about it. And when you're kind of early, in your experience as a storyteller, you start to look at those tropes because it's like shorthand for, okay, well, how do I tell an action story? Let's blow something up, you know?
Hmm. The School of Michael Bay.
Exactly, right. And again, you talk about horror for a second, but I'll kind of toss this to you. I was watching Friday the 13th Part 2 the other day, and Tegan, my kid, happened to walk in right at a scene where, and I can't remember the character's name, but it's the girl with the dog who doesn't wear a bra very obviously, and
Yeah.
and she goes skinny dipping, and then I kind of stopped and thought like, this is interesting. It's not just, my kid walks into the room right when there's a girl like stripping naked in a horror movie. But then I was like, oh, I should be embarrassed. But at the same time, I'm like, this is a really good example of like a textbook horror movie. It has good kills, it has a good villain, it has a campfire tale, it has like, tits and blood and murder and tension and like a big cast of characters to take out one by one. I'm like, I think it pretty much checks every box.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of does. It even has the third act storm that we often talk about
Yeah, I
in,
didn't even
in horror
remember that.
movies.
Yeah. See, there you go, right? So while we're on the topic, if you're telling a horror story, Mike, can you think, and I know, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but can you think of some tropes that, I don't know, are either some tropes that people should avoid because, oh my God, like they're so played out, or like I mentioned, are there some tropes that are just, hey, these are tried and true, and if you don't know what to do, try this.
Well, I mean, when it comes to horror movies, there are a bunch of extremely played out tropes. Now, that's not to say that you can't still use them. Because again, this is we're gonna talk about something we've talked about many times on both the Boogeyman's Closet and here is the rule of threes. Now, if you're gonna tell like a joke, for example,
Hmm.
don't tell it more than three times. Like
Yeah.
because you tell it once and it's either funny or not funny. You tell it the second time and it's like, okay, we already heard that. Sometimes when you tell it the third time, it's like, okay, it's funny again.
Yeah.
But if you do the fourth, it's like, all right, you fucked it up. So it's like the rule of threes. But so you can take a trope that doesn't work and still make it work. For example, I've talked about the jump scare trope that I really cannot fucking stand. We talked about it in Never Hike Alone recently over on the Boogeyman's Closet, but that thing where it's like the protagonist is watching the villain from a hiding place, or from a vantage point where they think they're safe, and then the villain walks out of frame only to stick their face back in frame or their weapon back in frame, and it's like you see it coming a mile away. It's never a surprise, but it's used over and over and over again, so much so that I talk about this all the time, but the remake of Nightmare on Elm Street, there is a scene where Nancy is hiding in a closet from Freddy, and you can see it's telegraphed so far away that she's going to turn around in that closet and Freddy's going to be behind her. So
Hmm.
much so that the first viewing, I saw it opening night in a packed theater. I was down by the front of the theater because there was no seats left. I didn't even look at the screen. I turned and looked at the audience behind me because I knew there was going to be a jump scare. And sure as shit, when Freddy popped out, the entire audience jumped. And I'm like, really? You guys didn't see this coming? Like, and it irritated me to no end because it was so telegraphed. But yeah, so stuff like that, the jump scare, the bait and switch of like, oh, they walked out of frame, no, they really saw you, like that kind of shit I hate. The ticking clock, we always that is such a tired trope. Stop giving me a countdown until something bad happens. Like, and it's always one of those things where when the countdown is impossibly short.
Hmm.
A perfect example is Army of the Dead. I know a lot of people loved it. I personally did not like it at all. But the final sequence, there is a character who has to fly across Las Vegas. So he's in a helicopter. He goes from one building to another building. So we're counting travel time here.
Hmm.
He has to fly to another building. He then has to fight his way through a throng of zombies in a building to get to our other character, to get them back up to the roof, to the helicopter, to fly out of Las Vegas before an explosion happens. And it's a 15-minute countdown. So it's like you're telling me you flew halfway across the city to another building, then fought like 18 zombies, grabbed this person, rushed them back up to the roof, multiple floors of running up the stairs, getting back in the helicopter and flying out of the city before the bomb went off.
No.
No, that didn't happen. Stop it. I fucking hate the ticking clock trope. But yeah, there's so many tropes that you should avoid, but if you understand the language of the movie, you can effectively do it. You can still effectively play with the ticking clock trope because we've seen it done countless times where it still works. Um, but like it's one of those things where I think every one of these cliches is going to be a rule of, if you don't If you can't handle it deftly, don't do it at all.
Yep.
But if you can, you might be able to play with it. They're tropes for a reason because sometimes they work. They're
hmm
cliches for a reason because sometimes they work. It's just everybody tries them and not everybody succeeds.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Yeah, and those are great examples. And I don't mean to get hung up on horror specifically. It was just that I knew, that that you could talk at length about a lot of them, but
Right.
right. But no, I think you make a great point, and I'm glad that you did, which is that again, when you're trying to come up with a story or you're thinking about where is my story going, what am I going to do, what kind of a story is this, it's important that you understand the tropes. And what I'm saying is do some homework. That's what I'm really
Mhm.
trying to say. Like anybody can sit down at a keyboard or a microphone or whatever and start telling a story. Sit down at a campfire, start telling a story. Please go for yours. Like I think that's awesome. But you know, especially if you're in like a commercial setting, like do you really want to write a novel and try and sell it to people and it's just full of all this clearly amateur stuff that where it's obvious that you just couldn't be bothered to Google some things, like, look up some stuff,
Exactly.
it's really easy to just literally just Google, horror movie tropes, action movie tropes, romance, tropes, cliches. And yeah, some of the stuff that you might find, you would think, you know what, like, yeah, those are fun. I like when horror movies, do X, I mean, I don't like jump scares, but as an example, since we're on the topic, like if you're the type of person that watches horror movies and you just love the jump scare and you're sitting there in anticipation, like
I
waiting
see what you did there.
yeah. Yeah, and you're just waiting for the jump scare, then great, put a jump scare in your story too. But again, just Google it. Like Google some examples of some bad ones. What are some good ones? Like think about it. And I think that's really the heart of what you and I are both trying to say is just think about what you're doing, please. Don't
Yeah.
just spit the story out onto the screen or, the podcast recording or whatever. Like you got to have at least a little bit of forethought in like, what am I trying to do here? You know?
Exactly.
Um,
But the whole thing with tropes and cliches is, like we said, they are used often for a reason. So if you can come up with a way to use it interestingly, like try
mhm,
to find a way that you haven't seen it done before, like it, because it can be cool if you can do it right. So don't be afraid to go against the normal trope. Like take that trope, turn it on its ear, play with it a little bit. One of the things that I talk about all the time on the Boogeyman's Closet is when you can take the standard and turn it on its ear, it suddenly becomes interesting. Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is the perfect example. We took all of like the sexuality tropes of like the teen slasher movie
mhm,
and we swapped the genders.
mhm,
Like we made the girls constantly oogling the guys. We made the guys, like be the prize, and
mhm,
like they were the scream queens. There was so many fun things, but they were straight up tropes.
mhm,
So if you can take a trope or a cliche and turn it on its ear, like don't be afraid to play with it. Don't be afraid to make it your own. And because people are going to understand that familiarity, but it's going to be something different, and they're not going to know at first. They're not going to know why. Like I said
mhm,
with Nightmare on Elm Street 2, the first time I watched it, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like it was confusing, but then it's like the more I watch it, I'm like, okay, I see what they did with this, and it became very interesting. So it will grab your audience. Like it will make them want to know more if you can do it interestingly. So, but that's
yes.
hard to do. Don't do it off the bat, learn the language first.
Yeah, exactly. Learn the language and then create your style, because yeah, what you're talking about, I always think of as the rule of cool, which
Yes.
I think, that's another, tip on this list, which is, don't be afraid of the rule of cool. We're sitting here telling you like do your homework, understand the tropes, understand the cliches. I think you need to do that. And then at the same time, like I mentioned with the jump scare example, or you mentioned with the, like, mixing up like the sort of gender politics of it is understand what you're doing and then go and play with it in the way that slang words, play with language. Find the thing that you think is cool and just have fun with it. But no one else is going to think it's cool if it's just the same old thing that we've seen 100 times, you know?
Yes.
And the one example I always think for fantasy novel fans out there, and where I actually heard the phrase "real cool" for the first time, was with Brandon Sanderson. Yeah, I think he's pretty popular now. That the average person who is vaguely into book talk probably knows. He's the creator of the Mistborn series. He took over the Wheel of Time when Robert Jordan passed away. He's really, really prolific. He writes shitloads of books, has a big company. But the reason I mention him here is because his first big hit was this series called Mistborn, which is a fantasy series about people who literally ingest metal shavings that gives them superpowers, which in a fantasy world setting seems weird. But he was like, well, I just wanted to tell a story about superheroes because superheroes are cool, but I really know fantasy stories really well. That's what I've been doing. I've written like 11 of them, and that's what I grew up with. So it was like, but I just really wanted it to do superheroes because they're cool. So I came up with a way to put superheroes in my fantasy story because it's cool. And I'm like, I love that idea, you know?
Yeah, no, that's really awesome. I enjoy that as well.
um, so moving on from there, let's swerve into character a little bit. We kind of talked about doing some homework, thinking about the structure of your overall story, but I think we should really, really talk about character. And you mentioned things being interesting, and that's, I think, at the heart of any story. Again, there's no hard and fast rules. You can tell a story that doesn't have people in it. Of course you can. It's been done. Like, you can tell a story about, the history of the planet Earth, or a story about, aliens or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to have people in it necessarily. But, most stories are about people. And at the heart of it, I think the reason that you tell a story, or the reason that a story is successful and interesting, is because something interesting happens to the character that you're writing about. Like, you could literally sit down and write out everything that your neighbor did yesterday, and sure, you could use interesting words and fun turns of phrases and make it poetic, but at the end of the day, like, did he do anything interesting, or is he just like going to work and feeding his dog and watching TV with his kids? I mean, where's the story?
Right.
Like, something interesting has to happen. And I really get baffled when I read books and comics and watch movies sometimes, because I feel like there's so many people out there who they're trying to have a style. They're trying to be progressive and
Yes.
edgy, but it's clear they don't understand the underlying language, because they're telling me a story about, oh, here's this, I don't know, artsy fartsy student going about their day, and I'm like, cool, they're cool. I like their style and their taste in music, but why am I fucking watching this for an hour and a half? Like, what is happening? Like,
Yes.
you know?
Well, see, this is something that once again, I'm going to be bringing up horror movies a lot because not only is that the most common entertainment that I ingest, but it's also the most common thing that I write in my spare time is horror
Yeah,
stories. So it's like my love language in writing is horror.
right.
Um, but yeah, it's something that you can see very very vividly in a lot of amateur horror movies where it's like they they have an antagonist. They have some kind of monster, some kind of slasher, some kind of villain. They want fun kills because why are most people watching a slasher movie? Well, most people are watching it to see interesting kills and probably tits. That's 90% of your viewing audience for a slasher movie. And then you're going to have a bunch of old heads like myself who are just like, back in my day, I remember when Jason was still alive. Like we're going to be watching it because, love of the game, basically. Um, but you have a lot of these horror movies where they'll have an interesting villain, they'll have interesting kill ideas, but none of the cannon fodder have any reason to be there. They just try to
Hmm.
write interesting dialogue or silly dialogue or funny dialogue, but there's no substance to these characters. Now, I know, Mike O'May, you're listening, you're probably going to hate me on this, but fucking Thanksgiving is the perfect example. None of those characters had a reason to be in the movie. They were just there to be killed by a talking turkey Muppet. Don't get me wrong, I love the talking turkey Muppet, but
Right?
the characters were there was no substance to them whatsoever. Now let's juxtapose that against something like Never Hike Alone, which we gushed about, because here is a movie. It's literally a one man show.
Mm-hmm.
For the people who have not seen this flick, it's a fan made Jason movie, like a Friday the 13th movie, about a YouTuber whose entire channel is about nature hikes and exploring and testing out like camping goods and stuff like that's how he gets his sponsors. So within the first 5 minutes of meeting the main character Kyle, we know everything we need to know about him. He's a YouTuber, he's an influencer, he loves being outdoors, he's an experienced hiker, so he's going on a rough trail and he has this whole like 8-day trek, set out in front of him where
Mm-hmm.
he's just like, yeah, I'm going to go, like, I'm going to be out here for a week. I'm going to be exploring these mountains. I'm going to be following these trails. Like, within seconds we know who he is,
Mm-hmm.
and then when we see him get put in danger, we care. We're like, oh shit, is he gonna escape? So it's like you have to make your character at least interesting enough that your audience is going to want to know what happens to them, and they're going to care about what happens to them. Like if you make your characters just a bunch of cannon fodder who have little quips and one liners, no one's going to care.
Mm-hmm.
We're all just going to be like, okay, when are they getting an axe to the face? Like
Yeah.
that's all we're going to care about. you know. And I think Cabin in the Woods is probably the prime example of this, where you take the characters that are tropes. They are literally walking tropes.
Mm-hmm.
We turn all of those tropes on their ear for every character. So we have the big dumb jock who is actually the smart guy, who is in a, he's not a big horny asshole who's fucking everybody. He's in a committed relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The smart, virgin girl was actually fucking her married teacher, and she makes some stupid moves. The stoner guy is the survivor girl. Like, I love the fact that they took all those tropes and turned them on their ear while making every single one of those characters interesting characters that we like within the first 15 minutes of the fucking movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is what you need. You have to make your characters have a point. Like they need to you as the audience need to know why they're doing what they're doing, and you need to care about them. That's all you have to do to make a successful character.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Oh God, I have like so many things I could like riff on, that all of what you just said. Like, oh, I could go in like different directions with this.
Right.
Um, and there's a weird meta level to that too. And I can't remember the actor's name, but yeah, the stoner character that you mentioned, who, usually it's the stoner character who's just like off getting high somewhere and gets slaughtered by the slasher or the monster or whatever. But
Yeah, he's
spoiler.
usually the dinner bell.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. But what's really funny too is, they cast all of the actors to type, and then they flip the trope on its ear, like you mentioned, with what's his name, Chris Hemsworth, right? The Thor,
Mhm.
who, yeah, he's like the big dumb jock, but actually he's like the super smart, academic type. But of course, you have to cast somebody who looks, who's like a big jock dude,
Yep.
the actor who plays the stoner character, the reason that he wears like sweaters and long sleeve shirts the whole time, even when everybody else is in bathing suits, in real life, it's not because the character was like, too cool to go skinny dipping or whatever. It's because the actor, because he was trying to land roles, he's fucking ripped. He was like really, really in good shape. And then he got this role as the stoner, and they were like, fuck, like, no one's going to believe a stoner with huge pecs. So they layered him up with like sweaters and stuff.
I never knew that. That's funny as hell.
Yeah, but yeah, you really nailed it with in terms of like you have to care, and I think there's like a spectrum, or maybe like I'll say there's like steps to building that, because the opposite end of that, and I think as we talk about these tips, it's like, okay, we want you to do this, but don't do this, do this, but don't do this. And so, yes, we want to care about the characters. We want to know who they are. We want a backstory. We want a personality. We want some interesting thing that kind of pinpoints them. Yes, the jock, the stoner. You don't necessarily have to boil it down to something so simple, but it kind of helps the audience to put a hook in that character. So,
Mhm.
but what you don't want to do is the opposite of that, which is this huge info dump of just every fucking thing, their whole life story, where instead of taking 15 minutes to get to know a cast of characters and then boom, you're into the action, instead we spend 45 minutes while everybody tells, their whole fucking history and we learn everything about them. And it's like, Jesus Christ, enough already. Like, don't overdo it. Uh, and,
Right.
and the main reason I bring that up is I think about prose because yes, I think about comics a lot. You think about horror movies a lot. That's just our wheelhouses. But when you think
Hmm.
about writing prose, the number one thing that I can't stand when I read a short story or someone who's trying to write a novel, and this is where I'm going to be really snobby because, whatever, we've established that precedent that we're a couple of snobs, right? is, you know,
Exactly.
from time to time, and I'm sure you've been in the same boat, you have a friend who's like, oh, like I wrote this really cool short story, or I wrote the first chapter of a novel I'm trying to write, and you read it. And what happens is the entire first couple of pages is just, Mary Sue like lived in New Jersey and she was in the eighth grade and she had a best friend named, Cindy who lived next door. And it's just this like list of information about them. And
Mm.
it's especially bad in fantasy stories or sci-fi stories because I feel like what you have is amateur writers who feel like they just need to set the stage immediately and they're kind of afraid to parcel things out a little bit at a time and not just info dump. And so like you get these fantasy stories that's like 1 year in the kingdom of Thraxac on the third moon of whatever, and it's like, Jesus fuck, I don't care, like just tell me something
The
interesting.
kingdom of Thraxac.
I don't know. I'm just making this shit up, but like it sounds like every like stupid fantasy story. Like so many fantasy books
Oh.
open up with these big long paragraphs with like made up names and like it's like you're reading the Bible, like in the year of the reign of the prince of Thraxac there was a plague on the planet of Ripidum I'm like, so why do I fucking care about these made up bullshit words? Like, what is this? Like, what am I looking at?
I, I'm just gonna throw down the gauntlet now. We have to come up with some kind of fantasy story at some point in this podcast where the kingdom of Thraxac becomes the thing.
Done. I'm writing it down. The Kingdom of Thraxac. We're gonna put it somewhere.
I don't know why that tickled me the way it did, but holy shit, dude, I'm cracking up over here.
That's awesome. Oh man.
Thraxac.
Thraxac.
Oh fuck.
And we're talking a lot about characters specifically, but like I said, when you said what you said, and I was like, oh god, I can go in so many different directions. I'll kind of rein it back into. I mentioned that example when I was in that Facebook group, and it's about like this idea of like how do you grab somebody right away? And I mean, we're kind of segueing into like the next thing,
Yes.
right? You got to care about the character, and caring about a character is one way that you can kind of grab your reader so that they want to know more. They want to keep reading. They want to keep watching the movie, like whatever it is. Um, and what I had said in my little rant was that the first page of a comic book should be something interesting that makes me want to turn
Yep.
to the second page. And, I got a lot of backlash in the comments of people talking about how, well, yeah, but like, you look at like manga where the pacing is really slow with the Japanese storytelling, style, or you have these big, thick graphic novels and you have plenty of space so you can like ease into the story cinematically with like an establishing shot and like a setting caption and, some mysterious stranger. And I'm like, yeah, all well and good, but like what I was talking about specifically is like the 22 or 24 page like pamphlet comic. The fucking
Right.
bitches that cost like $5 now just to get like one issue of a comic. When you've got 20, two, or let's say you got less than 30 pages to tell me some kind of a story. First of all, I don't want just a piece of a longer story because your single issue is just a chopped up graphic novel that you're trying to sell to me twice because fuck you. But
Hmm.
but like you need that single issue should tell me something. It's just like if you watch a movie, like yeah, there might be, I don't know what 12 movies with Jason Voorhees, but like every one of them tells me something. Like it's a bad example
Right.
necessarily, but that's kind of the point. Like everyone should tell me something, and you gotta grab people. Don't waste real estate. And the example that I showed
Right.
was, here's a comic where I opened up the page and it's like an establishing shot of this is the setting and this is what we're kind of talking about and kind of giving you an idea of what the comic is going to be about. And it kind of saves the cool, like, 2 page reveal of the action for, like, when you turn the page and you get page 2 and 3 facing each other. It's like you turn the page, bam. And I get that, but that first page had a little hook in it that was like, ooh, like, remember this old character? Did you forget about them? Turn the page, boom, there they are. But then in the other
Mhm.
example, it was literally just, it was like 4 panels of a mountain, a cloud, an airplane, and then like a voice bubble coming out of the airplane. And I'm like, what the fuck is this? Is this a comic about like disembodied ghosts talking on planes? Like, what is this comic? Why do I give a shit about somebody talking on an airplane? You gave me 3 panels to establish the fact that, guess what? Airplanes fly in the sky sometimes over mountains. Did you know that? Like, Jesus Christ, get to the fucking point. Like, don't wait until page 2. You get to the point on page 1, or fuck you. Sorry, I'm getting mad now because I wasted money on that shit.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. Like, you and I used to talk about this all the time back in the day when writing comics. Um, where it's like you have to open with a punch and end with a cliffhanger.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of people I know they write now for graphic novels.
Hmm.
It's the whole six issue structure and all that. But back in the day, back when we were kids, comics weren't written that way.
Hmm.
Sometimes it was a 2 issue story arc, sometimes it was a 4 issue story arc. Like there were no just there was no industry standard of it has to be, so many issues to tell the story.
Hmm.
Um hell, sometimes you just get a standalone comic where the entire story was told in that one issue. Like I remember the what if Spider-Man died, where like Thanos killed him, and it was just like I remember going into God, this is the Summit Park Mall. And there was one of those spinner racks that
Hmm.
had freaking comic books on it, and I saw Thanos holding a dead Spider-Man. I was like, I
Hmm.
gotta read this. I need to know. And like it was like a what if story, but the whole story was told in that issue. So, like I said, back in the day, it wasn't always written that way. So the idea was open up with a punch, do something in the first 2 to 3 pages that is going to grab your reader's attention. Like, yeah, sometimes there has to be a small bit of setup, but at least show me something interesting, show me a setting, show me something where it's going to
Hmm.
take place. And then, on that page turn or, the next turn after that, something major happens. There's something that happens to these characters that is either going to be the ignition point for the story or is going to be something that took place before the story happened. And now we're going to reference the thing we just saw to tell the real story, whatever it is. You have to have a punch. Open it up with something that would grab the reader's attention. And then in a comic book, you want to end with a cliffhanger. You always want to, like, unless it's you're wrapping up the
Hmm.
story, if there's more to the story, end with something that is going to keep the reader going, fuck, I need to know what happened.
Right?
So you're
Yeah.
going to come back for the next issue. And in movies, there's the same kind of setup where we always talk about the cold open. Like think of movies like The Ring,
Hmm.
or we've been talking about Friday the 13th. Fuck. The remake of Friday the 13th, the 2009 remake,
Hmm.
where we open with some kind of hook that is going to interest us right away. In the case of The Ring, it's the two girls talking about, oh, did you ever see the spooky video that, oh, 7 days later you die, blah, 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 ha, ha, ha. And then the one girl who did see it,
Hmm.
she gets the phone call and then we find her dead. And it's like, oh shit, she actually died. What is this about a mysterious phone call? And the movie starts.
Hmm.
Like we're off and running. Friday the 13th, the 2009 remake, you get all of these established characters pretty quick. And I'm not going to say we care about all of them, but we at least kind of know the role that each of them are playing
Hmm.
within like 5 minutes of the group talking. And then we get the introduction of Jason. We get some amazing kills. We see what this film is going to be about. Bam, there's the opening title card. Let's go. And it's like,
Hmm.
so you care right away within like a couple minutes of screen time. You're in. You're
Yeah.
you're you're here for the ride. I think my favorite example of that is the opening of Day of the Dead.
Hmm.
One of my all-time favorite openings in any movie, and it immediately, the first time I watched it, it had me hooked so fucking hard. Because it's like we open with these guys in a helicopter. There's some military, some guys that don't look military. They're flying over a very empty city, and it's like, you got this happy little
Hmm.
music, and then they land and the music deepens and you get this like dun 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 dun, like this
Hmm.
creepy theme, and you just have one guy yelling into the void of this empty city, "Hello, is there anybody out there?" And you see how empty this
Hmm.
entire city is until the dead start walking toward the noise. And you realize as the audience, holy shit, the entire world is fucked. You know, in 5 minutes, you see the scope of how horrifying this story is going to be. And then we move into a tighter, we get to the bunker, we meet the rest of the characters, and we kind of run from there. But that first couple of minutes, if that don't fucking grab your eyes, I don't know what will, telling you a horror story, because that shit is intense, but it grabs you immediately and you know the world you're in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that that's awesome too when you think about, like, I was talking about a comic book, like, again, like a 20, 4 or less than 30 page pamphlet comic. I want to know on the first page, just grab me so I keep going. You're talking about a movie. It's
Yes.
like, okay, so that's like, okay, so give me 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, I want to be interested in this movie. Like, you can go a little bit slower because of the passage of time, right? You have an hour and a half or however long
Hmm.
your movie is. Okay, fine. If I'm sitting down to watch a movie, I'm probably committed to, okay, if I like this, I'll give it an hour and a half. Just like if I sit down with a comic book, okay, if I like this, I'll give it 30 pages or whatever. Like if I sit down with a
Right.
novel, okay, if I like this, I'll give it, maybe a couple of days of my life in my spare time. Like, you don't just, I mean, sure, people sit down and just like, let me just look at this and see. But a lot of times it's like, okay, I want to try this out. So you're willing to put the time in. So if you're going to put in an hour and a half, I'll give you 5 minutes, right? If you're going to give you 30 pages, I'll give you one page, whatever. And
Right.
yeah, and I think it's different by the format. Yeah, a lot of the backlash in the comments on that Facebook post I got were people who were like, "Oh yeah, but it's like in a movie when they just want to like zoom in slow and like acclimate you to what's going on." I'm like, again, fine. If it's a 300-page graphic novel, I'll give you the cinematic approach. Not my personal favorite, but I get it. But this is a 24 or whatever page comic book. Like, dude, stop wasting time. I don't care about the fucking building the people are in or the fucking plane that they're on. Guess what? I've seen drawings of buildings. Get to the fucking point. Like, Jesus Christ, I don't care. Like, if I hate establishing shots. I mean, that's just me personally. Again, it's one of those like guidelines of comics. Like, you got to establish the setting. Where are your characters? Like, is this the future? Is it today? And I think that's true across pretty much every medium. But like in comics, I personally can't stand it when the establishing shot is on the first page, or if it is, it should just be one panel and then give me something else because I don't want to read a story about like a caption box that says Chicago and then a city of a skyline. I've fucking seen Chicago before, dude. Like, why did I buy this? Like, get to the point.
Right.
Oh man, and
I couldn't agree more.
sorry, I'll say two more things before we move on. This is, I love this idea when it comes to novels. I mentioned that like some people will sit down, yeah, you read a novel over a couple of days, couple of weeks, however long it takes, depending on how, slow of reader you are. I unfortunately am a slow reader with as much as I do read. So novels can be a little bit more of a commitment. And so I have a little bit of a personal bar set high when it comes to novels. I really want to be grabbed like right away. Like I hate those stupid, fantasy first paragraphs about like, the kingdom of Thraxac or whatever the fuck. um, but goddamn, do I love the first sentence of a novel when it's really Joyce, when it's really good. I remember being in the seventh grade and my English teacher. I think a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people, you can think back to that like one teacher who was just like really cool and just really opened your mind to something you never thought about before. That one who like changed your life. And for me, it was my seventh grade English teacher because he did a whole lesson plan on, I want you to write one sentence that makes people want to read the rest of the novel. But you're only going to write one sentence, and then we're going to hang them up, and then we're going to have an anonymous vote, put them all up on the whiteboard, and people are going to pick the best ones, not as a competition, but just to kind of illustrate what people are drawn toward. And like, let's look at that. Like, why were these ones the best? Like, what makes people want to keep reading? And I
Hmm.
always remember that. It's one of those things that just sticks in my brain forever. And when I read novels, I remember the first sentence. My favorite one of all time is from,
I know what you're gonna say.
right? It's from Stephen King's The Gunslinger, right? It's the man,
Yes.
the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. Jesus Christ. Like,
Yep.
I immediately want to know who is the man in black? Like, that's a cool ass name, like Johnny Cash. Who the fuck is the gunslinger? Like, I want to know. In fact, when I actually did pick up that book for the very first time at my friend Ben's house when I was in high school, I literally sat on his couch and read the entire novel in one sitting because I was grabbed by how it opened up.
I still remember because I hadn't read The Dark Tower. I hadn't read any of The Dark Tower yet. I had read a lot of Stephen King, but I remember you and I were actually at the discount bookstore that used to be in the Factory Outlet
Oh
Mall,
God,
where
yeah.
we used to get like the old trade paperbacks and old audio books when they were still on cassette.
Hmm.
Like, um, but I remember us going there and they had The Dark Tower. They had a couple of the books, and you were like, "Oh man, did you ever read this?" And I was like, "No, I haven't gotten to that yet." And you picked up the gunslinger and showed me the first line. And I was like, fuck, that's good. Like that
Right.
was it is such a good opening. In fact, before when you first started talking about this, like when you started going down this trail right now, I immediately pulled up the gunslinger on
Nice,
the internet
nice.
because I'm like, I fucking love that opening line. If he doesn't say it, I'm gonna,
Yeah,
So
yes, exactly,
I'm
right.
glad you did.
Well, so I have two more quick examples before we move on from this, just because I love to like talk about these things, and I could go on and on. So I'll limit myself to
Mhm.
two. But do you have any other examples that you want to mention?
Not that I can think of with a book. There's definitely been plenty of films where within the first like couple of seconds, I'm like, I need to know more.
Hmm.
But yeah, I can't think of any books off the top of my head that really grabbed me outside of that one.
Yeah, for me, I always think about it like, give me the first sentence, then the first paragraph, then the first page, or the first chapter, and then you got me. Like, I'm hooked from there. Like, if you can get, it's like you have to step me
Hmm.
into it. You know what I mean? But yeah, the other two examples that I love, one I had to look up to get the wording right, and one I also just knew because another one of my favorite books of all time is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which starts with
Mm,
"It was a pleasure to burn." Oh, 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 chef's
yeah.
kiss, chef's kiss. That whole fucking book is like one giant long poem. And then the other one that I had to look up, and they do it in the movie adaptation too, which is so great. And I actually don't like this book, but this sentence is perfect, which is from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson is, "We were somewhere around Barstow on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold."
Yes. Yeah, I was gonna say as soon as you started talking, I'm like, oh yeah, fuck, I forgot about this one too.
So good. Oh, I could go on and on. I could go on and on. Like I think quote unquote real writers, like you think about stuff like that. I think it just goes back to what we were saying
Yeah.
before about like, think about what you're doing, please. Like, just take a step back and think about, what you're doing. Like, make us care about the character. And sorry, just to back up because I started mentioning something about like, steps to caring, and then I got all caught up on like, ooh, first lines of novels, like squirrel. um, but it's like you have to start with the what did you call them, like the stereotypical roles, right? The
Hmm.
jock, the stoner, the virgin. You start there, and then you go, okay, now add a layer. Like, if you have time, right? 'Cause sometimes characters just walk into a scene and it's like, sometimes they're there to serve a purpose. Like, you need a nerd, or you need a horny best friend, or you need someone to, to walk in and say something, sure. But
Hmm.
like, if you're going to follow a group of characters, start with that sort of high level, what's their stereotypical role, and then you add something to them. Give them like a funny little quirk, give them a tick, an accent, a joke, something, just something to where I can remember that that's who that person is. And then there's those additional layers. Okay, if you've got the time and you're not, wasting pages and pages or minutes and minutes and minutes on too much backstory, like, give me a little bit more. Like, it's okay to start with the basics. Again, like in a horror movie, sure, like people come on screen, you're like, oh, like, the cheerleader, the football player, the prankster, the stoner, the horny guy, like, it's they're all
Hmm.
there. The whole team is there, but like then you add something, and that's how you make it interesting.
Well, and also, and this is like a hat on a hat here, but a trope on a trope. When you're talking about like the different stereotype characters, you also have the interesting either interesting hobby or interesting look. There's always that character that there's really no character to them.
Hmm.
It's just we need something for this person to stand out. So I always think of like in the movie Spookies,
Hmm.
terrible fucking movie, but there's a guy who always has like a puppet. He's doing like ventriloquist shit the entire, and he's just cannon fodder. He's just there to get killed at some point. But he's got the dummy, so you remember him because like, oh yeah, the guy with the dummy, or like you mentioned this in, I want to say it was Once Bitten, um over on the Boogeyman's Closet, we were talking about Stuart Charno,
Hmm.
and you had mentioned that he's the guy, the reptile guy
Yeah.
from friggin' just one of the guys. And it's like, yeah, you recognize him because he was the weird reptile guy. Like he didn't
Yeah.
have any role. It was just, oh, that made him stand out. So it's
Hmm.
that idea of, or like in, oh God, the fucking movie Demon Wind, there's like a kung fu magician. Like, why? Because there is.
Right.
Dead Alive, the Kung Fu Priest. Why? Because there is. So sometimes you can just take a character that is literally a throwaway character and give them something ridiculous and over the top that makes them memorable, that makes them stand out. And why would you do that for example, why would you do that in a film? Well,
Hmm.
because it's going to make people talk.
Yeah.
People
Hmm.
are going to talk about it after the movie, and then it's going to make other people go, wait, what movie was this? Wait, the Kung Fu Magician. Oh, I got to check this out. And
Right.
then they go and they watch it because of some stupid shit, but it's a throwaway character that just grabs attention.
Hmm.
And that's like taking a trope and kind of turning it on its ear. You have the trope of the dumb cannon fodder character that no one cares about. Maybe they're playing the role of the lonely virgin who's never going to get laid, who's always horny.
Hmm.
Like maybe they're playing that role, but for some reason they have a ventriloquist dummy and they're constantly talking with it.
Yeah.
So it's like they're fitting the role of the trope, but you've taken that trope and made it a little more interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a perfect, elaboration on what I was trying to, clumsily get at with like my steps. But yeah, exactly. Like give a little something, like I always think of Brad Pitt in Ocean's 11. Every character in that movie fills some kind of a role. They're, the acrobat guy or
Hmm.
like, the smooth talker or the guy who has the sleight of hand pickpocket, whatever. Like they all kind of like fill a role. But Brad Pitt's character doesn't really have a specific role in the overall plot other than he's just one of the two ringleaders. But what makes him different than George Clooney's Danny Ocean is that Brad Pitt's always eating something. And it's this
Hmm.
little thing. It's this tiny little thing that he was probably hungry on set and was just like, fuck it, like roll camera. I'm not done with my shrimp cocktail. But at the same time, it just becomes this neat little character trope. And it's like that's fun. I'm glad that somebody thought of that.
Hmm. It's just a visual thing to make that character stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're kind of also segueing into is, another one of these tips, which is you gotta have some kind of motivation. And we touched on this a little bit before when we were talking about how, yeah, you can tell a story, I guess, about anybody, like your boring neighbor, but like, what interesting thing happens? I mean, yes, we talked about make something interesting happen, but part of what can make something interesting is there's got to be some kind of motivation. What makes the
Yes.
main character that you want to talk about is something is disrupting their regular life and they want something. They want to go on a quest. They want to, get the hot girl at school. They want to, graduate from college in the face of conflict or, whatever. Like they have to want something that then becomes okay, this is like the starting point for not the interesting characters, but the plot. Like what's going to happen? But if the character doesn't want anything, then you're just telling me like their day, like he went shopping and went to work. Like so what? So
100%. No, there has to be a reason for us to care. Like, what is it that the character wants?
Yeah, exactly. And I gave a couple of examples, and one of the things that you can do, and here's a tip, not just like, hey, people, like think about these things, but here's an actual tip, which is, you mentioned the rule of threes. I think that's great. That's a great thing to keep in mind, which is, you can kind of pay attention to how many times you're doing something, or if you can repeat something. I know Stephen King talks about it in his book on writing, which is a great book, not only about
Mm-hmm.
writing, but it's also kind of a autobiography. But he talks about parallelism in his own writing, where he'll bring up the same phrasing or like the same quote or something. You think about it. How many times in it does somebody say something about, beep beep Richie, or we all float down here?
Yep.
And he says it over and over and over again, more than the rule of threes. But it's like it's the same kind of concept of, like, think about how you can kind of build in some of these hooks that keep bringing people back, like, hey, remember that thing, hey, remember that thing. you know um
Mm-hmm.
but my tip here is that I think everyone knows what a protagonist is, right? You mentioned it before. It's the main character. It's who you're telling the story
Mm-hmm.
about. And for the sake of simplicity, like, we'll keep this like, okay, it's about one guy. Like, yes, again, you can tell a story about, no people or lots of people, but usually there's a main character, and then usually there's a bad guy, like an antagonist. It could be a monster, it could be a, person, whatever. It's the thing that's opposite the main character. Good guy, bad guy. What I like to think about is the protagonist wants something. And it might just be like, I want my normal life to stay normal. Like, I think of, like, Frodo Baggins, like, just leave me alone,
Right. He just wants to stay in the Shire.
Exactly, right. But the protagonist has to want something. The antagonist wants the exact opposite. That doesn't make the antagonist evil. Sometimes the antagonist is not the quote unquote bad guy. It's another character, but it's the character that wants the opposite thing as the protagonist. And again, I think a lot of people know that, but what I think is interesting, and I learned this a couple years ago, which is that in a lot of stories, you have, like, the best friend, the Ron Weasley, whatever, the girlfriend. There's other characters around, and it gives you an extra level of uh, like, building blocks to tell a story if one of your other characters is what is sometimes called the companion, right? The companion character,
Mm.
which is, and it can be a companion to the protagonist, it can be a companion to the antagonist. But to keep things simple, the companion is the character that wants the same thing as the protagonist, but they want it for very different reasons.
Mm.
And the example that I think of is The Dark Knight, the movie The Dark Knight. I think most people have seen it. You could probably, follow me on this example, which is in The Dark Knight, Bruce Wayne. This isn't Batman in general, but specifically in this movie, Batman, or
Mm.
Bruce Wayne, doesn't want to be Batman anymore. He doesn't want there to be a need for a Batman, right? He wants Gotham to be a
Right.
place where Batman doesn't have to exist. The Joker is the antagonist because he wants the opposite of that. He doesn't want Batman to go away. He has that whole speech in, like, the police lockup where he's like, "What would I do without you?" Like, as much as he's
Exactly.
right, as much as he, like, tries to kill Batman, it's the conflict, because that's what that does. When Bruce Wayne wants one thing and the Joker wants the opposite of that thing, it creates the conflict. But then who else is in that movie? You get Harvey Dent, the other, like, main character. Harvey Dent is the district attorney, and he wants the same thing that Bruce Wayne does, but for different reasons. He also doesn't
Mm-hmm.
want there to be a Batman, or he doesn't want Bruce Wayne to be a Batman, because he wants to be the hero of Gotham. He wants to be either the hero district attorney who puts the mob away, or hell, just put on the Batman suit. Like, he wants to be the hero. So you get Bruce Wayne, who doesn't want there to be a hero. Harvey Dent wants to be the hero, and then the Joker, wants the opposite of that. And the conflict that immediately arises from that relationship before you've written one scene, like, you can just imagine the things that can happen from there.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's just one of those tips I'll throw out there. I won't go down that road too much farther, but just think about that, and think about what the characters want. Your protagonist wants something. What do the other characters want? And that's where you start to build the story. Like the main character wants something, like he wants to be left alone. Okay, fine. So then something has to happen where he can't be left alone. Boom. Now you are
Yep.
telling your story. That's how your plot begins.
I think you can see that being used in some of our own episodes. Like, for example, let's go with one of the more wacky ones with the first Vangabus of horror, where it's like, we have our main characters. We establish them fairly quickly after the opening montage of death. So, like, we open it up with crazy death, but then we immediately meet our main characters, and you have the one character who is just trying to work. He's trying to get through school. He's trying to keep his grades up. He comes from an impoverished family. He's working, after school, and all he wants to do is make enough money to be able to focus on his studies. Like, he wants to go to college, he wants to do all that. Then you have our other two characters who are they just want to get laid. And so they need his help to run the amusement park rides. So the idea is, hey, we will give you money, the thing you're after, so we can get the thing we're after, which is pussy. So it's like we establish real fast, even though these characters are obviously all cannon fodder, we show the audience this is what they want, this is what they're after. Let's see if they get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like it's it's very easy to do. Like, it doesn't have to be very complicated. The example I just gave is very not complicated. One guy just wants to get through life and go to school, and two guys want to get laid, and that was the ignition point for our story.
Right. Yeah. And that's all you need. Yeah. Exactly. Like you give a little bit of that backstory of like what makes those characters kind of interesting. What's their personality. In retrospect, I'm like, okay, there was like Tanner and Jasper. Was that the names? Because I
Yeah,
think
Tanner and Jasper, and then it was oh god,
BB,
what
right?
was
Wasn't it BB? Like,
yeah, but was it Bobby something? I
yeah,
can't remember. It's been so many years
I
since we've
figure.
done the first one.
Yeah, it was like Billy Bob or one of those kind of names where he was like,
Billy Bob, Billy
yeah,
Bobby, Billy
Billy
Bobby.
Bob. Yeah, he was kind of like embarrassed of his name, but yeah, no,
Yes.
it's kind of funny because that one, Jasper and Tanner are kind of like the two-headed companion because they're kind of the same character. Like they want this exact same thing, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, yeah, that
Oh.
and not to have to keep going backwards to that same topic, but I try to get us to follow our own advice because we always go down these rabbit trails, but more often than not, we do the same bullshit over and over again, which is we start the episode and we like key up the topic and we always try to just get to the point, but then there's like 25 minutes of, but first let's talk about the movie and like the actor and the director and my memory about why I like this and and like why we wanted to do this episode, like what's our motivation, and we end up going down, doing all this expositional introduction before we even get to the fucking story. you know um
Well, to be fair, I think we've also established we're kind of self-indulgent pricks,
yeah,
but
that's true, but at some point along the way, I don't remember exactly what episode it was. It may have been as far in as the trick or treat good to eat when I started doing it every episode, but it was there a few times before where I try to start the episode with like some kind of a joke at the beginning, the welcome everybody, this is the
Mhm.
podcast, and then it used to just be like, where we improv new stories right off the dome, and then but now I always try to have some kind of a joke, and maybe they work and maybe they don't. I'm always kind of just trying to see if I can crack you up, you know. But there's also a part of me that's like, just say something interesting immediately, because I know how we are. We're gonna end up rambling and yapping. So like, just hit them with a stinger right at the beginning, you know.
Right.
So it's kind of like that, that first line of a novel idea. Like, the audience can tell me if it works, but I always, spend time on that. Like my notes are usually more that, and then the rest of the episode is like a list of like movies and dates, and then we just riff it.
Yep.
um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's another tip on that. topic to kind of wrap all of that up in terms of like, characters and motivation and conflict and doing something interesting is, sometimes you start a story with a plot, like, or a plot idea, like, oh, I want to tell a story where this happens. Like, this would be a cool, course of events, or this would be a cool twist ending or something. And it's like, all right, cool. Start with your plot, build it out. But the very first thing you need to be thinking about is my motivation. Like, why is this story happening? What is the point of it, and why am I telling it? Find that character, figure out the motivation, and it's okay to back engineer it. You can literally just say, like, I really want to tell the story where, the Hobbit goes on the quest, to face the ancient spirit of the wizard and like throw his ring right in his fucking face. Like, cool, but like back that up. Like, okay, fine, why? You know what I mean? Like, and it's
Yeah.
okay. It's okay to kind of do it backwards. But then at the same time, on the other side of that coin, sometimes you start with characters. And I think you and I do this a lot
Yes.
in this podcast because a lot of it is like, okay, we want to take the characters from like this movie and like mash them up like we did with, the Arnieverse all those times. But it's like, okay,
Hmm.
cool. Let's have, John Matrix from Commando crossover with the Terminator. Okay, now what? And what you do here is like when you start with a plot, you don't think of characters, you think motivation, and then the characters make sense. When you start with the characters, don't think about the plot, think about the conflict first. Think about, okay, we want to match these
Yes.
two characters up. Why will they disagree or fight, or what do they, at the heart of their character, what do they have that will clash with the other one? Like, what does one want that the other one doesn't want? And then the plot will start to make sense.
Completely agree.
All right, I think, let's see. I'm looking at this list here, man. I think we've hit a pretty good amount of, kind of tips and given some examples. Just a couple of like basic nuts and bolts. I think we should think about that too. We talked about,
Yeah.
motivation and grabbing people's attention, but there's also just like,
Three
again,
act structure.
yeah, three-act structure is a perfect one. Think about what type of story you're telling. Is it a movie? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? Is it a comic book? Guess what? All of those things can be broken down into acts, right? Like the three-act
You're
structure is
right.
the most popular one. You and I use that here a lot. Shakespeare used the five-act structure a lot. Not just that his plays were often broken up into five acts, but you can kind of break up the storyline, and I won't get into all of that. A lot of novelists who write really long novels like fantasy epics, there's like an eight-act structure. You can Google all of this stuff. But at the heart of it, I really like the three-act structure. It's pretty basic, but it's this idea where in the first act, you have to have the inciting incident. It's the thing that's the most important to the first part of the story. Usually
Hmm.
it's somewhere in the middle or toward the end. But the idea is you introduce the characters, what's their motivation, and then bam, something happens that changes the life of the protagonist. They get kicked out of school, or somebody gets killed, or oh my God, there's a killer, like whatever. Like boom, and it's this rising action of introducing things, trying to make people care, and then bam, you hit them with something that shakes the whole story up. That's your first act, roughly the first, third of the story, right? I mean, roughly. Don't get too caught
Hmm.
up on like counting pages, Um, and then the second act, and I say this because you can kind of map this out ahead of time if you're not sure where to go, like, and you're thinking about your plot. Think about, okay, what's my inciting incident? You get into the second act, and this is where it should be like full speed ahead. I mentioned the rising action of the first act. The second act should be constant action. This is like, I think again, you think
Hmm.
about like a quest movie. I keep thinking like Lord of the Rings because I watched those movies not that long ago. But it's like now you're on the road and you're fighting off Nazgul and there's monsters and oh no, hide in the inn, and oh, like you meet the guy who's gonna help you, and oh shit, run there, run there. Like it's like you're running, or if it's a quieter story, fine. But you're moving quickly toward what the protagonist thinks is going to be the end of the story, the resolution. Oh, I'm going
Hmm.
to get this, ring to Mordor or whatever. But then, just like the first act has this inciting incident that shakes everything up, the second act has to have this catalyst moment. And it's usually where something terrible happens. It's like the exact opposite of what the protagonist wants, what their motivation is, the worst possible thing happens, and then everybody is in despair. The protagonist doesn't know what to do. They're reeling, their motivation is destroyed. They hit rock bottom. That's where you kind of wrap up part two. Like, oh shit, we thought they were going to win, but they didn't. uh,
Right.
and you think about like a lot of sports movies do stuff like that, where it's like, oh, they go play that first game against like the big rival team and they get their fucking asses handed to them. They're like, oh, we tried so hard, right? And
Yep.
then you go into the third act, and the third act is where you dust yourself back off. The protagonist wallows in their, depression and their, shattered dreams, and then, something happens with the characters. They're talking, or somebody has like a surprise, whatever. Something happens to make them protagonists snap out of it and go, you know what, we can do this, yeah, let's go. And then you rise the action back up, ultimately to the climax. And just like you had your inciting incident, and then you had your cataclysm catalyst, moment in the second act, when you get to that climax, that's that third one. But a good climax is never going to be exactly what the protagonist wanted. Remember, when the protagonist was racing toward the thing they wanted, boom, cataclysm, catalyst, everything went to shit. But when they try something else, the climax usually is something where there's a really nice resolution to the story, but it should never be exactly what the protagonist wanted. Something a little bit different, that, oh, this is what they really wanted all along. They just didn't realize it.
Exactly. Also, a good climax is often loud. Hi-oh. Sorry, I had to say it. I couldn't help myself when you kept saying good climax. I was like, damn it, I gotta say it.
Oh man,
Oh,
and
God.
let's just hope that it's mutual.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah. So Mike, I feel like I've been talking a lot. What
Oh.
about you? I think we're kind of wrapping up here, but any last tips you want to throw out there? Maybe some nuts and bolts.
I think the biggest one, and the biggest one for me, is kill your darlings. Um, do not be so beholden to any story idea, any character, that you are not willing to change it for a better version of the story. This happens all the time on this show, where you and I are, because we're improving the story. It's like one of us will kind of have an idea of where the story should be going, and the other one will have a different idea where the story should be going. And then like at some point, like especially on episodes where we can tell we're both kind of going and we're pulling in a different direction,
Mm-hmm.
we will pause and just be like, okay, hold on, let's talk about this for a second, so we're not fumbling on the actual recording.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, we'll pitch back and forth, like, where are you going with this, where are you going with this? And it's like, oh fuck, your idea is way better than what I had. Fuck what I had planned, let's go with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do not be afraid to do that, because I find that most creators who are just like, it's like, no, this is my idea. This is how I want it done. This is how it needs to be done. You're not willing to even let your own story breathe. You're trying to hold it in this death grip
Mm-hmm.
where it's not allowed to grow. It has to be a living, breathing thing. Now, you will often hear writers talk about this. I know you and I have talked about this, where, and hell, Stephen King talks about this in Misery. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a big thing in Misery about falling into the hole in the page. Like, you don't tell the story. You transcribe the story as it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the characters decide where they're going to go. And yeah, you're the one creating it. So of course it's all happening in your own head, but your brain is logically putting it into the next step. And sometimes that next step is not what you had planned. And
Mm-hmm.
when you try to force it back to that plan, it comes across as hackneyed and trite. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do that. You have to be willing to let your characters die or survive depending on what you have planned. I think the first time that happened to me was I'm sure you'll remember this story, but we've talked about this many a times on this podcast, where you and I used to write comic books constantly. We had this concept that, one day we'll just be writing comic books as a job. So we were always writing, 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 writing. And
Mm-hmm.
I was working on a zombie epic called The Dead Will Walk the earth. And there was a character who I 100% had planned to die. It was the older sister of one of the younger characters. I want to say his name was Billy because I always use that fucking name. Um, but like it was the older sister, and she was going to sacrifice herself so the little kid and Russ, the other guy that was with them, could escape. And that was what I had planned. I had it planned my entire time. I was like, she's gonna die so these two characters can get away. But the scene played out in a way where she escapes at the last possible second. And I sat there at the keyboard going, I didn't plan for that. Like it just played out that way as
Hmm.
I was writing. And I was like, holy shit. Wait, this works so much better than what I had planned. And then I had more of a story arc for this character, and she ended up in a more pivotal role later on when those characters are fighting against the scavengers. So it's like there was this entire character arc that was never planned. It was planned for her to die, but because the story was breathing in its own way, it was living in its own way, and I wasn't trying to force it. I was just letting it naturally happen as I was writing. I surprised my own self with my own story about how much it needed to change. And I think that's something that every writer needs to be able to do. Shift on a dime, change tactics, change what happens to a character. Don't be afraid to let that happen organically. Kill your fucking darlings. Do not have any idea that is so stringently held that you're not willing to change. And I think that just goes, and this is just, I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a minute. That just goes to life in general.
Right.
Like I was bitching about this at work. I'm like, never, I don't care what your beliefs are. I don't care what your politics are, what it is. If you are presented with new information that you didn't have before, do not be afraid to change your mind. If
Hmm.
you have new information, process that information and come up with the next logical conclusion. Writing is the same way. If you're like, okay, in my head, this character they're going to do this, do this, and then they're going to get killed here. And if when you get to that point where they're going to die and along the way something has changed where it no longer makes sense for that character to die, you let him live. Or you have a character that you're like, no, they're the hero of the story. They're the hero. They're going to survive the entire story.
Hmm.
And then you get to the point of the end where they're fighting, and it's like, no, you know what? It makes more sense for them to fucking die and have
Hmm.
the sidekick character be the real hero. You do that. You do whatever it takes to tell the best version of the story that you're telling. So do not be afraid to kill your darlings.
Yeah. Amen, brother. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, dude. And we do that all the time on this podcast, all the time. I think that's
Oh
probably,
God, yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a piece of advice that we follow. And part of it is because we're improving, again, as much as we can. So it's
Hmm.
hard to always go into an episode with, okay, I had this very clear vision in my head of where we're going with this. I think we always kind of have some idea of like, okay, like, let's do a story about, trying to think of an example, like, like in The Great Pumpkin, like let's do a story about how, Linus grows up and he never got over being rejected by the Great Pumpkin. It's hard not to think ahead of time, just in your spare time, like, okay, he would do this, and what if he did that, what if he did this? And what happens sometimes is we come to the table and we both have a pretty clear idea of, okay, as we go through this, there's a couple of like cool beats that I thought of, like fun scenes that I want to hit. And sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. It's
Hmm.
the competition of the other person who, you had the things you wanted to do and I had the things I wanted to do, and like you said, we're kind of, competing with each other. Sometimes we're at odds with each other, and sometimes it's just because we're both contributing. Sometimes it ends up going in this other direction where we both really like it, but then you start to realize, oh, if I follow that road, I'm never going to get to those other cool things I wanted to do. So c'est la vie.
Yep. I think again, using the Vanga bus as an example, I didn't plan for Billy Bob to die. Like that was never planned. Like
Yeah,
he was gonna be the final girl. In fact, we even joked about it when we came up with the name of Billy Bobby. We're
yeah,
like, we have a final girl named Billy Bobby. That's funny.
right.
Like it was just like it was silly, but it made more sense for the character to die. It made more sense for everybody to die in that story.
Hmm.
So like it surprised even me, and it was my pitch. Like
Yeah,
I was just like, oh shit, I didn't expect that to happen, but it made perfect sense.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking at our episode list, and I'm like, oh, there's like so many examples of like things I can bring up that are like, fit this example. In our last season when we did the snakes in space crossover with,
Yeah.
with Snake Plissken and Marion Cobretti, because that was the sequel to like two other episodes, we kind of had to plan it out at least a little bit. But I had some very clear ideas in my head of things I wanted to do. And then when we started riffing and improving in, live, it was just like, oh, well, this isn't going anywhere where I thought it was, but fuck it, and just kind of like
Yeah, yeah.
threw it away. I threw away this whole idea that I had, like, well, if we get there and we're not really sure what to do, I kind of had this like backup plan, and I was like, ah, fuck it, we don't need that backup plan, or or
Right.
in Never Kill the Dog. That's a really interesting example from season 3 because that was one where I already had this really detailed plot structure for a graphic novel, a comic book, but the the gimmick there of the episode was, what if I brought it to you and I just kind of like said, here's the gist of the story I wanted to tell, and then I'm going to try not to think about that too much and let's just see where it goes. And what if you and I can tell a different story based on the same premise? And we did
Hmm.
we did end up successfully doing that. I mean, I had to insert some things just to kind of like get us off, from the starting point and like get the ball rolling. But by the time we were done, the story was so different than what I had thought of for my comic that I actually, like, I'm gonna steal some of the stuff we did for the episode because I'm like, oh, that's better than what I had in the comic.
Right.
But yeah, like I said, there's so many examples. Black Friday was an interesting one too because that's the one I think where we were the most at odds with each other because we were trying
Yep.
to do a murder mystery, like who done it with a large cast, without telling the other person what we wanted to do, and we were just kind of like tug of warring back and forth with like, well, I want to kill this character, and then you were like, well, what if we kill this other guy instead? Because like you secretly wanted that character to be the killer, and it was this
Yep.
it was this whole weird thing. I don't even remember now. It was one of the female characters that I had, one of the ones that you wouldn't think of. It was either like the one girl that the twins were always hitting on, or it was like the older customer, the older lady, I forget. But my whole idea was, well, I'm going to pick one of the characters that would be the least obvious. Like the bimbo or the old lady, like those tropes, but
Right.
but
Right.
but then when we finally just paused the recording to talk about it, you told me your idea, and I'm like, oh, so that's why you kept making that guy come back when I tried to kill him. Okay, yeah, I like your idea better. And I just completely threw my whole thing out. Like, ah, fuck it, who cares?
Well, and that's the thing. I feel like we've both done that countless times on this show where it's like, one of us came to the table with like a bunch of ideas, and then the other one had a singular different idea. And it's like you come to the table with all those ideas, and then you hear the other one's idea and you go, oh, well, fuck me, get rid of all that. Let's go with that. And it's like
Yeah.
sometimes it's just it's worthwhile to throw out all the work you've done
Hmm.
and start fresh if it's a better starting point, or if it's a better, or like the ending, if it's a better ending point.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how many films that we've seen over the years where there was, an ending that just didn't test well with audiences, so they film a whole new fucking ending.
Hmm.
Prime example, Army of Darkness. Like Ash wakes up in the future and he's like, oh god, I slept too long, oh no, everything's destroyed, versus the whole fucking S-Mart ending that
Ah,
we all saw in the theater.
so much
And it's
better.
like, do right, do I like the time travel ending? It's very Ash, it's very in character, and it's very funny. But to end your trilogy on a joke seems a
Hmm.
little like, why did we watch all this? Whereas, having Ash still fighting the Deadites. Like, yeah, he fucked up. He's like, yeah, I said the words more or less, and it's like he fucked up. The Deadites are still out there, but you know what? He's still kicking ass and getting the girl, and that's what we want to see in the ending. That's a much better ending than the original one that they had planned. So is the original ending terrible? No, of course not. It's still fun, and there's going to be people out there who prefer it. But for the vast majority of the audience, they're going to prefer the theatrical one because that's in line with the character. That's in line with what we've been seeing the entire movie.
Yeah, yeah, and they had to be open to feedback to get there, and the thing that they ended up with was so much better than the original
Hmm.
idea. I mean, you can gauge, funny versus funny, but just in terms of the ending that we got in the theatrical version, it leaves things open for a sequel. It leaves the main character very confident
Yeah.
and strong, the character you've been rooting for the whole time, right? It shows you that the conflict isn't all gone. Like there's so many storytelling like hooks that it leaves you with that just from a structural point of view, joke versus joke, throw those away and just look at the storytelling structure like we're talking about right here. It's like, oh shit, like the theatrical ending lays so much better just in a nuts and bolts kind of way.
Hmm. 100%.
Yeah, and to risk belaboring the point even more so because that's what we do around here. um you know Sometimes if you're willing to kill your darling, the thing that you love, that you went into this thinking, oh man, it's gonna be so cool when I get to this one scene, it's gonna be so badass. And then if you're willing to sacrifice that and let it go because something else makes more sense, it's more organic or it's funnier, or it just works better, like go with it. But again, sometimes you get something even better out of it. In Army of Darkness, they got a better ending. We got a whole other episode out of it. When we told
Hmm.
Yule Parish 2 at the end of the last season, we all three of us, including Sam, went into that with so many ideas. Oh, I want to do this and this and this and this, because we had 2 years to think about cool things to do with Jurgen the Yuletide Avenger. And then we were kind of, I wouldn't say we were like at odds with each other, but we were all three of us trying to make a story that made sense. And it was like, oh, I want to get to
Right.
this one thing. Oh, I want to do this other thing. Oh, I wanted to have this one cool scene. And like, by the time we were done, we came up with this really fun episode that we were all happy with, but there were so many things left on the cutting room floor that when we picked them all up and, bundled them all together, we're like, well, fuck, there's a whole episode here. Shit, let's do another one,
Yep. That was a really fascinating writing experiment because it was one of those things where, after the first Jurgen, which the first Yule Parish, um, it was, a game. Sam, gave us
Hmm.
tropes and things we had to work in. Now, the second one, there was no game. It was like, okay, now we have to play off of what's already established and let's continue the story to its next logical point.
Hmm.
And we were all pulling in a different direction while agreeing on certain things. It was like, we'd get to a certain scene, like one of us had one idea, one of us had another idea, and then we'd kind of like find some crazy bombastic thing that all three of us were like, you know what, fuck it, that's fun, let's do that.
Yeah.
And we kept doing that throughout the episode, and we got this insane sequel, where Jurgen became more of like this hulking brute, than we had made him in the first one. But then we quiet it down and bring a lot of those ideas from the second one that we were gonna introduce, and we use those in the third one,
Hmm.
and we tell a completely different story that was completely unplanned.
Yeah.
And I fucking love the trilogy. I like it made me so much happier to have that third episode
Hmm.
because it was like we got to tell this crazy mid story, and then we got this quiet end. And I feel like following the three act structure we kind of did with the three movies
Yeah.
where it was like, we introduce everything in the first one. We introduce, like who the big bad is, what his connection to the main character is, how that all works together. Then we show the action in the second movie, and then the third one is the resolution. And it's
Yeah.
like i I thought it was a really fun thought experiment and writing experiment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that about applying the three act structure. And I think you're absolutely right. And it didn't really plan on doing it that way. I just think that as storytellers, you and I, we think about things like that kind of subconsciously, where I think,
Hmm.
if we can give ourselves credit for it and it wasn't just some like cosmic coincidence, it's like, again, I think we think in those terms all the time because we tell stories all the time. And,
Hmm.
kind of harkening back to something I said at the beginning of this episode in terms of like, well, what kind of fucking pedigree do we have for to tell people how to write stories? I mean, I've never published a screenplay. I've never published a novel, I mean, but we made some comics. You've written screenplays.
Hmm.
We've written a lot of things. And like I said, we've done 87 episodes where we've told fucking stories. And sure, maybe it's like just a podcast, but people used to make fun of like, oh, it's just a straight to TV movie, and now that shit dominates the world. So, we'll get there.
Hmm.
um, but like, uh, there's a really good example. Again, going back to comics, because that's always my wheelhouse. There's this amazing book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Anyone
I love
who
that book.
Oh, it's so good. Anyone who is a comic book fan should read it, even if you're just a casual fan. And I've mentioned it before. It was one of the first comics that was ever recommended to me when I was really getting serious about collecting when I was like 12, and somebody older was like, "Oh, here's the stuff you should read, like, Watchmen and, From Hell and The Dark Knight Returns and, these sort of like serious graphic novels." And then definitely read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And it's a textbook in comic book form. It's not at all boring. It's a book about how comics work as graphic sequential storytelling. Like it's about how the brain and the eye can transition in time from panel to panel and scene to scene. Like why things that are drawn as static images, you think of them as moving, you think of time passing, and it really breaks down the structure of how comics work as a storytelling medium. But then here's a bunch of guidelines and rules about how to lay out pages and how to, draw the eye. That's an example you mentioned earlier about your mom with like not understanding like video game logic. I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me that they don't even know how to read comics because they don't know
Hmm.
what panel to look at next. Do I go to the left? Do I go down? And my answer to that would be, well, you're reading the wrong fucking comics because if you can't organically follow from panel to panel to panel naturally, then the artist has not done a good job of storytelling with the pictures, right?
Agreed.
Which is something that I learned from understanding comics years ago, and I think about that all the time. You can diagram a good comic book page, and you can draw the line of exactly where your eye goes if you lay it out correctly, and you don't need instructions. Every time I see a comic with a little arrow that points from one panel to a next, I just think failure, dude. If you have to draw a fucking arrow in there, you fucked up.
and we did that in our
Yep.
very first comic book before deciding, you know what, we're gonna scrap this and redo it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And hey, man, we make mistakes. I lettered our entire finished 80-page graphic novel in Comic Sans font because I didn't know any better in the early 2000s. Oh,
But
I'm
yeah, I mean, I think that though that's a really good example because that original opening to our first comic book, Pie, like we weren't storyboarding it. We
no.
were drawing it as we came up with the ideas. And so it didn't flow organically. And we kept trying to do things like, again, we talked about 90s comic books having these weird layouts and all that, but we didn't understand why the layouts worked. We were
Hmm.
just like, yeah, like do that, like have a triangular panel for some reason. Yeah, that works. And it almost reminded me of the early days of slave labor graphics, how we had like Gloom Cookie and like Voltaire and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. And like some of those books didn't even have panels; they were just like images on a page, and it's like, what am I looking at? You know. But we were playing around with the
Hmm.
layouts, and but again we had the foresight to be like, all right, look, this is already a fucking weird story idea, this is already a lot of insanity captured in one book, we need to make that opening better. And
Hmm.
then we went back and I redrew the opening, and we added pages, like we made it, we added a little more tension, like we added stuff to make the reader go, ooh, what is that, ooh, what is that,
Hmm.
and then we have the opening horror happen,
Hmm.
and it's like, oh, hey, look, now it makes sense, whereas the first time around it's like, this is a bunch of garbage, what is this? So
Right? Because we didn't know what we were doing. But what we did is we killed the darling. We put
I was just
all
gonna say, but we killed our darling.
Yeah, we put like hours and hours of work into that, and then even more hours of work doing the follow-up pages, trying to make the opening make sense to where we were going organically after that. And it was like, you know what, the opening just doesn't work anymore. So like, even though we put all those hours in, throw it out, start over, put even more hours in, and that's exactly what we
Mm-hmm.
did, and I think it worked out. I'm still really proud of that book, minus the choice of Comic Sans and one line of dialogue that I'm sure you
Yep.
understand what I'm talking about. Other than that, I'm still
100%.
I'm still really proud of that book, and it's weird and bizarre, but it works. We had fans, we had good reviews, and I think
Mm-hmm.
we somehow pulled it out of our asses, but you know, again, I kind of come back to us focusing on doing this podcast, and back to what I was saying about Scott McCloud and understanding comics is when Scott McCloud wrote that book, what has become basically the go-to text for comic book, fans and creators to explain how comics work. I mean, they teach it in college courses now. It's the authority on how comic storytelling works. Sequential storytelling is the term he uses, or sequential art. But Scott McCloud, when he wrote that book, he had people asking him things along the lines of, "Who were you to write this? Like, who the hell do you think you are to write this textbook to presume to understand how comics work? You haven't had a storied and successful career." And Scott McCloud's response, and of course I'm paraphrasing a book I haven't read in a while, is he was like, yeah, I had done this underground, little known independent comic book series, and that's pretty much it. But over the course of making that series, I got interested in what I was doing and learning about how to do this better. And I started reading and studying and paying attention. And I realized that I had gathered all of this really interesting knowledge that I learned on my own to make my own comic better. And I thought, man, other people should be able to know this too. Like, I had to do
Mm-hmm.
all this homework to find it. What if I could make it easy? And because he was so interested in the process, he decided to write this book. And you know what, like, he fucking nailed it, and no one ever questions his authority and pedigree now. Hell, he's done like sequels to that book that are almost as highly esteemed as the first one, so good on him. But you know you could say what you want to say about a couple of podcasters who've never had a screenplay turned into a movie trying to tell you people how to write. But I just say, like, hey, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, we think about this shit a lot. We spend a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
talking about it. And I personally just wanted to have an opportunity to come on here and say, hey guys, like, oh man, there's all this cool stuff, because I read so many bad comics and so many bad books that I was like,
I've watched so many bad movies.
it just makes me sad, man.
Yep.
Okay.
But one last thing, because I know we got to wrap this up, but I feel like this is the perfect time to bring this up. Is the last thing that you and I had discussed about writing that's very important is finish it. Do
Mm-hmm.
not let perfect get in the way of it. Like, finish your story, because here's the thing. You're always gonna think about how you can make it better. It's like I always I know, I forget who created this quote. I don't know if it was Da Vinci who created this quote, but they said that no piece of artwork is ever finished, only abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that is 100% true, because every drawing I've ever done, I can finish it and look back at it and go, oh, fuck, I would have done this different. I would have done this different. I would have done this different. Same thing with stories. You look at a story and you write, I look back on episodes that we've recorded and I'm like, oh, I love them, but fuck, if I had been thinking about it, I would have changed this or I would have
Mm-hmm.
changed that. And like, that's understandable. That's always going to happen, because your memory is 2020. Basically,
Yeah.
or what was the hindsight? That's where the hindsight is 2020. You're gonna look back and realize all the mistakes you made. But here's the thing: if you never fucking finish it, you'll never be able to look back on it and go, "Oh, I wish I had a done that."
Mm-hmm.
You need to finish it first so you can move on to another project. And this is something I talk about when I'm training people at work all the time. Is you're gonna make mistakes. You don't. It's not a matter of if; it's a matter of when. You are going to make mistakes. So own it, learn from it, and move on. And the same thing is true with storytelling. You're going to make mistakes. When you realize you fucked up, okay, own it, learn from it, don't do it again the next time.
Mm-hmm.
Move on. tell another story. There's always another story to tell. The well does not run dry. Even when you feel like it runs dry, it has not run dry. Trust me. With all the fucking stories that you and I have written in the last 20 years, or pitched on this podcast, or talked about in email and text, we have come up with thousands of stories that might never see the light of day
Hmm.
because, we're working on other stuff,
Yep.
but we're still finishing stories. And that is one of the biggest things. If you take away nothing else from this episode, take away that. Whatever project you're working on, whatever story you're trying to tell, whatever song, visual art, movie, podcast, novel, whatever it is, whatever your creative pursuit is, finish it. Do
Hmm.
not worry about it being perfect. Just put the fucking nails in the coffin and finish the damn thing.
Right.
That is the most important part.
Absolutely. Just get to the end. Yeah. Oh yeah. I can't
Yes.
repeat that advice enough. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned us having like, thousands of story ideas. And yeah, we have. We've been telling stories together for fucking 25 years at this point, like Jesus Christ. There are so many, comics we never finished, screenplays we never finished, children's books that we started. And one of the main reasons I wanted to do this podcast, I mean, part of it was seeing the success and the fun that you were having with Boogie Mets Closet and then with Count Creepyhead Saturday Morning Monster Mash. But then it was like, to me, it was that light bulb. We talk about how the light bulbs go off when we're telling stories. For me, it
Hmm.
was the light bulb of podcasting. That's what we should try. Something where, we can just finish it. Like we just go on there and tell a story. This is great. It's
Hmm.
it's the perfect way for us to get a finished product in our busy lives with jobs and kids and all these other things that make doing, the writing on the keyboard with, prose or screenplay or whatever, all what makes that so hard and time consuming. And it's like, oh, we can just get on here and like just tell a story, but there's still work to do. There's always work to do, like with the editing after we're done
Oh,
recording. God, the fucking editing.
always
I
the hardest part.
It is. It is. I can't stand it. And if this is a 2-hour episode, I guarantee you I spent 6 or more hours editing it, which is crazy. And it's like I could have written short stories and like, like a whole graphic novel in the amount of time. I edited one episode, like let alone the
Hmm.
number of novels I could have written and all the fucking weeks and months of my time that I've spent editing, over 100 episodes before this one. But this is my last piece of
Yep.
advice. I loved your last piece. Just finish it. I'm going to say this. My last piece is it's also at the other side of that is just not only just start it, but just work on it. Just do some.
Yeah.
And like what I do when I'm editing is I will procrastinate like hell because I don't like doing it. And I'll go, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. But every single time for, what's the number? 112 episodes before this one. Every single one of those times, the reason that the episode got finished, I got to what you said, it just fucking finished it despite it not being perfect, was I said, okay, it's been long enough. I'm just gonna spend 5 minutes on it. That's it. Just 5 minutes. I'm gonna
Hmm.
I'm gonna open it up and I'm gonna save the file and I'm gonna clip off the stupid like chit chat that we do before I jump into the welcome everybody thing. And like even if that's all I do, just 5 minutes, just to do something. But what happens every single time is I start working on it and I go, oh, let me do this, let me do this, let me do this. And before you know it, 5 minutes turned into 30 minutes. And then, cool, now I feel good.
Hmm.
The next day, oh, fuck, I don't want to go back into that. You know what? Just do 5 minutes. And it works. And me saying just do 5 minutes turns into 6 hours and the episode comes out.
Yep. No, 100%. I mean, it's the same way with editing on the Boogeyman's Closet. I have to, trick myself into doing it because it's the boring work, it's the busy work, it's part of the creation process that isn't fun, but it is a necessary step to get the thing finished. So a lot of times when I edit, I tend to do there's a couple different things I'll tend to do. I'll either put on like a game that I can play mindlessly and listen and then just pause it anytime I need to start making an edit, or I sit there and I doodle. So I'll be drawing, and sometimes I'll just doodle stuff of like what we're talking about. Like
Hmm.
when I was editing Once Bitten, I was just drawing this goofy, like skinny little vampire dude on my notepad, just like because I'm listening to the episode, I'm waiting for anything I have to like clip or any sound bits. I have to like, bump the sound up, bump the sound down. But I'm just doodling while I'm doing it. So I'm making sure that like I'm distracting myself while still doing the job. So it's
Hmm.
like, get it finished.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I either do silly games like crossword puzzles that keep me busy without like using a lot of my brain power, or
Mhm.
I'll just like pay my bills. All right, Unc, I appreciate you joining me on this one to share some storytelling tips. Uh, as usual, like we went on longer than I expected, but man, there's so many things that I think we could talk about, and it's not just us, sitting in front of the class, telling all the pupils the rules, but just trying to share some advice that things that help us to tell stories that we think are fun and keep our motivation high so that we want to keep coming back, and hopefully the listeners, you guys keep coming back. So yeah, I'm glad we got a chance to do this, and there are so many more things on the list we didn't even get to, so maybe there'll be another one. We'll see if you guys have some good feedback on storytelling tips with Unc and Jefe.
Agreed.
All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. As always, you can find us online at raisedbyrentals.com, at raisedbyrentals on the socials. We also belong to the Rad Pantheon, a super team of podcasters, artists, musicians, all sorts of creative people supporting each other to help spread the gospel of rad stuff. So if you like this show, definitely check out the other projects at radpantheon.com. And what about you, Mike? You have a couple of projects in the Rad Pantheon. What do you have going on?
Well, there's the Boogeyman's Closet, which you can check out on Facebook and Instagram. We are doing our Vampire Comedy Month. We've covered a couple of 80s vampire comedies, and we've also done our little Friday the 13th special, which was a lot of fun. And then, of course, there's Count Creepyhead Saturday Morning Monster Mash. If you like toys, you like wacky comedy and Muppets, check out Count Creepyhead Saturday Morning Monster Mash.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Those are always a great time. And yeah, appreciate you having me on recently for a couple of guest appearances on the Boogeyman's Closet. That was definitely a lot of fun. I always appreciate the chance to get to do that. And yeah, I just have this growing list of like, oh, more movies I want to talk about if Mike ever lets me come back and do it again.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in once again to the Raised by Rentals program. If you had fun with us, visit us on those socials, drop us a line, leave a comment, leave a podcast rating. Let us know what kind of storytelling tips you guys are interested in. And with that, I'm Jefe,
I'm Monk.
and we have to return storytelling for dummies to the library. Raised by Rentals is a member of the Rad Pantheon network. Visit radpantheon.com to support rad stuff. The theme music is Forbidden Fruit by Velvet Bethany. You can purchase music and learn more at velvetbethany.com.
You said fuck me cock dick.
There's your stinger.